Statement calls the next witness.
Good morning, Your Honor, Counsel, ladies and gentlemen. The state will call for their first witness, Dr. Lindsay Thomas.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do, yes.
And Dr. Thomas, if you feel comfortable doing so, we'd ask you to remove your mask. I will keep mine on.
I would love that. Thank you.
And let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Lindsay, Lindsey, Carol, Carol, Thomas, Thomas.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Thomas.
Good morning.
Would you please tell us what kind of a doctor you are?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
And what is a forensic pathologist?
Forensic pathology is that branch of pathology, which is a branch of medicine, where medicine and law overlap. So it could be anything with a medical and legal component. It could be toxicology. In some cases, it may involve living patients, but as I practice and as most forensic pathologists practice, it involves what's called medico-legal death investigation.
Does it involve taking care of patients in the clinical sense?
Not living patients, no. A forensic pathologist may be consulted to help with the evaluation and interpretation of injuries in a living patient, but not in a treatment or clinical sense.
So most of your work then is done on deceased people?
Correct.
Any specific types of deaths?
Yes, the state statutes lists the types of deaths that have to be reported to the medical examiner, and briefly they tend to be unnatural deaths, so accidents, suicides, homicides, unexpected deaths, potentially suspicious deaths, that type of category of death.
Do you get special training in how to determine the cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Tell us something about the special training you received.
Well, shall I start back in medical school or just just the end part?
Just the end part.
Okay. I did a fellowship in forensic pathology, which is a specified training program for doctors who want to be forensic pathologists to learn how to do medical legal death investigations and certify cause and manner of death.
So would you tell us what pathology is as a field of medicine?
Sure. Pathologists are sometimes considered the doctor's doctor because we don't directly treat patients, but we provide information to doctors who then do treat patients. So, for example, if you've ever been to a lab and had blood drawn, that goes to a laboratory that is run by a pathologist, a clinical pathologist. So, blood count, chemistries, things like that. Or if you've ever known someone that had a biopsy and was diagnosed with cancer, that's the type of pathology that is done by an anatomic pathologist. So you'd look at tissue and under the microscope and make diagnoses.
Is a medical examiner a forensic pathologist?
In Minnesota, a medical examiner is a forensic pathologist who is appointed by the County Board of Commissioners to be that county's medical examiner.
So it's a public official?
Yes.
So when you talk about the medical legal investigations, is that sort of a fancy way of describing what forensic pathologists do?
Yes, it's what the medical examiner's office does. It's death investigations, again, where there is a medical component and there may be a legal component.
Is it different from, say, a death in a hospital?
Yes. So if someone dies in a hospital, those are usually deaths due to natural causes, and they may have a medical death investigation in the sense that a hospital pathologist might do an autopsy, but they wouldn't do the full scope of the medical legal death investigation because those are mostly due to natural diseases.
What does death investigation entail?
Well, the way a medical examiner's office performs a death investigation, I think a lot of people assume it's all about the autopsy, the physical examination of the body, and that's really just a tiny part of the death investigation. The death investigation really starts at the very beginning when a death is found, a person is found deceased, or the office is notified of the death. We, as medical examiners, want to know all about that person. What's their past medical history, social history, family history. So we will do whatever we need to do to get that kind of history. Then we want to know, well, what happened, what were their terminal events, what happened around the time of their death. Were they complaining of something? Were they interacting with someone? Were they driving? Were they using, machinery, something like that? And then we'll look at the physical examination, and that part of the exam might include x-rays. It could include getting specimens for toxicology, for cultures, for all kinds of other laboratory tests, including looking at things under the microscope, little sections of each organ under the microscope. So that's the physical exam part. Then we'll look at the laboratory results. So that would be usually toxicology, but as I say, it could be blood cultures, or more recently it's probably been a lot of COVID testing, that kind of thing. And then look at the microscopic slides, and then put all of that together with the history, the terminal events, the physical findings, the laboratory findings, and then that's how the medical examiner reaches the conclusion about the cause and manner of death.
So all of that goes into a death investigation?
Yes.
Do you sometimes interview people also as a part of it?
Yes, the investigators who go to the scene may talk to family members. We certainly will talk to medical providers to get someone's past medical history. We often will interview or talk with law enforcement officers if they were the people who responded. It could be paramedics, EMS, troopers, just depends on the case.
I want to ask you about a phrase you use, terminal events.
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury what is a terminal event?
Sure. So when we're investigating a death as medical examiners, as I mentioned, we want to know as much as we can about this person leading up to their death, because that often, how they lived, will provide us information about how they died. When I'm talking about terminal events, I'm talking about what happened in the period of time around their death, shortly leading up to their death. So, for example, he was out shoveling snow, he came in, clutched his chest, and fell over. That would be an example of a terminal event. Or we know someone was driving a car and went off the road. That would be what the terminal events were.
Do you also rely on training and expertise on how injuries occur?
Yes, as a forensic pathologist, that's one of the things we look at and learn about is when we see this type of injury, we associate that with this type of event.
What does the medical examiner then do at the conclusion of a death investigation?
So the ultimate goal is to complete the information that's needed on the death certificate, specifically the cause and manner of death.
Is a report generated?
Yes.
What's the nature of that report?
Well, one of the main reports that's generated would be considered the autopsy report, and that's the report of the physical examination. But ultimately, the death certificate is kind of the final report.
Now, you told us as a forensic pathologist, you don't treat living patients.
Right.
So if we wanted to have a discussion, for example, about measuring lung volumes or air reserves in someone, that wouldn't be your bailiwick as a medical examiner?
That would not be me, no. By the time I see them, none of that applies, yes.
Right. So Dr. Thomas, are you currently employed?
I work, I'm kind of semi-retired. I do consulting, and then I work part-time at medical examiners' offices in Reno, Nevada, and Salt Lake City, Utah.
Reno and Salt Lake City, Dr. Thomas?
There are places I really like the way the office runs, and I like still to be involved as a medical examiner.
And pretty good places to hike.
And good places to hike, yes.
So where did you do your work before you were semi-retired?
Right before I retired, I was at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office as an assistant medical examiner. And do you want me to go before that?
Yes, if you could tell us your work experience as a medical examiner forensic pathologist.
Sure. Initially, I started after my training at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office, working as a deputy and assistant, then assistant medical examiner, and I was there for many years. And then in 1997, I joined the Minnesota Regional Medical Examiner's Office that was based in Hastings. And then I was chief of that office for 13 years. And we were the medical examiner's office for 8 counties in Minnesota, the largest of which were Dakota and Scott counties. And we also served as an autopsy referral service and medical examiner's office for many other counties in Minnesota, as well as Wisconsin and even one in Michigan. And then when our office outgrew that space, Dakota and Scott counties merged with Hennepin County, and that's why then I came back to Hennepin County.
So over how many years have you performed work or services as a forensic pathologist?
Let's see, 37 now, 36.
And in Minnesota, how many counties?
Oh, gosh. Well, I've been the direct medical examiner for 8 counties. I've worked in offices that have been consultant to dozens of other counties.
And have you also performed those services in parts of Wisconsin?
Yes.
When did you stop working at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office?
It was early 2017. I retired from Hennepin County.
And how many autopsies would you estimate you have performed over your career?
Probably about 5,000 that I myself did, and then hundreds, maybe 1,000 more where I assisted someone else, or I supervised, or I participated in some way.
So in 5,000 or so cases, you've determined the cause and manner of death?
Well, actually way more than that, because as medical examiners, we don't just certify the cause and manner of death for the cases that we do autopsies on. There are numerous other cases that get reported by law to the medical examiner's office where we don't do a physical examination. So, for example, an elderly person falls in a nursing home and gets a hip fracture and then dies a couple months later. That death has to be reported to the medical examiner's office. We will investigate that death by looking at the medical records and doing all of what I talked about, getting family input and medical provider input, but we generally will not do a physical examination, but still, by law, we have to sign the death certificate.
So you're still determining then the cause and manner of death?
Right. We're just not using a physical examination as part of it.
And using the medical records primarily?
Yes.
Dr. Thomas, are you licensed presently?
Yes, I'm licensed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Nevada, and Utah.
Do you also hold any board certifications?
Yes, I'm board certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Have you worked with any professional organizations over the years related to forensic pathology?
Yes, I've been a member of many different organizations. Minnesota Medical Association, American Medical Association, College of American Pathologists, American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and then I've been on the board of the Minnesota Coroners and Medical Examiners Association, probably 30 plus years. And then I'm a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners, and I was on that board and a member of their executive committee for a number of years.
And that goes by the acronym NAME, N-A-M-E?
Yes.
What does NAME do?
Well, they're the professional organization of medical legal death investigators, specifically forensic pathologists, medical examiners. And as an organization, they provide support to medical examiners, they provide information, they provide guidelines, an accreditation program, an inspection program, lots of ways of assisting medical examiner offices.
Dr. Thomas, have you done any teaching?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I have been a clinical instructor here at the University of Minnesota Department of Pathology. I've done lots of law enforcement training through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension here in Minnesota, as well as, oh my gosh, teaching everything from middle school science students through high school and college and all kinds of professional groups, whether it's other forensic pathologists, other law enforcement, you name the organization that comes into contact with death investigation, and I've probably talked to some of them at some point.
Do you have any publications?
That hasn't been a main focus of my career, but I have several, and early on was involved in an autopsy protocol that was ultimately published by the United Nations that's still in use.
So let's switch topics and talk about your experience testifying in courts. Have you testified before in a court?
Yes, probably over 100 times.
And is that predominantly in your role as a medical examiner?
It's mostly in my role as a medical examiner, where I did the autopsy and then the prosecution would call me to testify as to my findings. I've also testified as an expert witness consultant in cases where I didn't do the autopsy, but I was called by maybe in a civil case, either by the defense or the plaintiff, if they thought there was a wrongful death or some question about medical malpractice, something like that. And then I've also been consulted and testified in cases at the request of the defense, again, not where I did the autopsy, but where I reviewed someone else's work, and then I consulted with the defense or testified.
And have you testified in Minnesota courts?
Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, Pennsylvania. I think those are the ones. Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Thomas, are you being paid for your time and services in this case?
No.
Could you tell us about that? How does it come about that you're not being paid for your time and services in this case?
Well, I didn't ask to be paid.
And so did you reach out to the state, or did the state reach out to you?
No, you reached out to me. And, I knew this was going to be important, and I felt like I had something to offer, and I wanted to do what I could to help explain what I think happened.
Mm-hmm. So what were you asked to do then in this case?
Well, I was asked to review a lot of the materials and come to an independent conclusion about what I thought the cause and manner of death were and the mechanism for that cause.
Could you give the jurors a general sense or overview of the kinds of materials you reviewed?
May I look at my notes?
Yes, if you need to refresh your recollection.
So I looked at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner materials, including the autopsy report and toxicology and photographs and microscopic slides, things like that. I looked at the Hennepin County Medical Center records, so Mr. Floyd's past medical history from there, as well as Health Partners medical records. Then I looked at a lot of interviews, many videos, including body-worn camera videos, bystander videos, surveillance videos, some photographs, still photographs, timeline, and then some medical literature and textbooks.
So were you the medical examiner who investigated or did the autopsy around the death of George Floyd?
No, that was the Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner.
Do you know Dr. Baker?
I do. He was a pathology resident when I was on staff at Hennepin County many years ago. And then when he did his fellowship, I was one of the staff people there. And then after our offices merged, I worked again with him at Hennepin County.
So would you have been then part of his training in his early formative years?
Yes.
Do you consider him a friend?
I do, yes.
Have you talked to him about this case?
No, not since right after it happened.
But you did review his report,
Yes.
and as well as Mr. Floyd's medical records.
Yes.
Did you review the history of terminal events for May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
So
And what was kind of unique, what was absolutely unique in this case was the volume of materials I had to review. I've never had a case like this that had such thorough documentation of the terminal events.
And by way of the thorough documentation, what makes it so thorough, in your opinion?
Well, the use of videos is unique in this case. Certainly, as medical examiners, we use videos, but there's never been a case that I've been involved with that had videos over such a long time frame and from so many different perspectives.
Are you aware then of Dr. Baker's conclusions then on the manner of death?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to show Exhibit 193 that's been stipulated to subject to Dr. Baker's foundation. So first, Dr. Thomas, what do we see here on Exhibit 193?
This is a copy of the certificate of death of Mr. Floyd.
Okay. And so, Brett, if we could kind of highlight just through the word underlying. Just to make it a little bigger to see. Okay. Based on your review of the evidence and the death certificate, do you agree with Dr. Baker's determination on the cause of death?
Yes, I do.
And is that by the word immediate on here?
Yes, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Have you, Dr. Thomas, formed an opinion about the mechanism of death?
Yes.
Would you tell us what that is?
In this case, I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen.
So we'll come back to the mechanism in just a minute. Can you explain to the jury what this cause of death means and why you agree with it?
Well, it's kind of in two parts. So there's the cardiopulmonary arrest, which it doesn't provide a lot of additional clarifying information because in a way everyone dies of when your heart stops and your lungs stop. That's cardiopulmonary arrest. But as a forensic pathologist, I would use cardiopulmonary arrest when to differentiate it from a cardiac arrest. So this is not a sudden cardiac death, a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. This is a death where both the heart and lungs stopped working. And the point is that it's due to law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and compression. That is kind of what ultimately is the immediate cause of death, is the subdual, restraint, and compression.
And just so it's clear for the jurors, does cardiopulmonary arrest mean heart attack?
No.
Does it mean fatal arrhythmia as a primary cause of death.
No,
It simply means that the heart stops and the lungs have stopped.
correct.
It's another way of simply describing death itself.
Right.
Can you explain what's referred to, looking here at the terms subdual, restraint, and neck compression?
Those were activities by the law enforcement agency officers involved. Subdual is subduing someone, trying to restrain them is, in Mr. Floyd's case, involved handcuffing him, his positioning on the ground, the prone position, the people kneeling on him. And the neck compression is the knee on the neck specifically. Additionally, there was some back and other things being compressed by the officers.
So if you put all this together, cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating, law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, what does that mean?
Well, what it means to me is that the activities of the law enforcement officers resulted in Mr. Floyd's death, and that specifically those activities were the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression.
And does this then also represent your own conclusion?
Yes.
A conclusion you have reached and an opinion you hold to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
Would you tell us what you reviewed in order to reach this conclusion?
All of those things that I mentioned earlier, again, what's sort of unique about this case is that often I would just review the medical examiner case file, and that would provide information about what the cause and manner of death is. But in this case, the autopsy itself didn't tell me the cause and manner of death, and it really required getting all of this other additional information, specifically the video evidence of the terminal events, to conclude the cause of death and manner of death.
When you make reference to something called the mechanism of death,
Yeah.
would you tell us what mechanism of death means?
So, cause of death is what's the thing, the disease or the injury or the process that caused someone's death. But the mechanism is kind of what was going on in the body at that time. So, for example, the cause of death might be a gunshot wound, but the mechanism of death might be blood loss related to that gunshot wound, or an infection that complicated that gunshot wound down the road, something like that. So it's more what was actually happening at the body level that resulted in the cause of death.
So focusing in on the mechanism of death here, how is it that the officers of dual restraint and neck compression caused Mr. Floyd's death?
So as I mentioned, I think the primary mechanism was asphyxia or low oxygen. And it basically is Mr. Floyd was in a position because of the subdual restraint and compression where he was unable to get enough oxygen in to maintain his body functions.
What's required for normal breathing, Dr. Thomas?
What is required?
Yeah.
Well, there are kind of three components. You have to be able to get air in, so you have to have what's called a patent airway, and that could be nose, mouth, soft tissues of the neck, the larynx, the trachea, the larynx, trachea, bronchi. All of that has to be open. At the level of the lungs itself, there has to be adequate air exchange between oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide going out. And then finally, the way the lungs work is it's kind of like a bellows, that when you suck in air, your diaphragm drops and pulls air in, and then when you relax, the diaphragm collapses and pushes air out. So all three of those things have to be functioning in order to get adequate oxygen in. So, for example, if someone is smothered or strangled, or they inhale a piece of hot dog, or they have pneumonia such that their lungs are completely filled, then their airway is obstructed so that there isn't adequate air coming in, oxygen coming in. Or if someone is in an environment where there isn't enough oxygen, so for example in a closed garage in which an old car has been running, there may be way high carbon monoxide, and in that case they're perfectly able to breathe in and out, but there just isn't enough oxygen. And then the third would be if there's some kind of restriction such that your chest can't expand, your diaphragm can't expand, so the bellows function isn't working. And if any one of those components isn't working, then the result will be this mechanism of inadequate oxygen.
Doctor, how does narrowing of the hypopharynx fit into this?
Well, the example I would give that people are probably most familiar with is sleep apnea or snoring. If you yourself or have a partner who snores, you know that especially in certain positions, what happens is the hypopharynx, which is sort of the soft tissues at the back of your throat, will kind of collapse because there's inadequate air coming, either forcing it out or forcing it in, which is why a CPAP machine works, because it forces air through that floppy area. And if that collapses, then it makes it difficult to get air in.
So, Dr. Thomas, what do you rely on to reach your conclusion that low oxygen was the mechanism of death?
In this case, it was primarily the evidence from the terminal events, the video evidence, that show Mr. Floyd in a position where he was unable to adequately breathe.
Mm-hmm. So how does the autopsy report itself assist you or not?
So the way the autopsy really helps is it's great for ruling things out. So in this case, the autopsy ruled out, for example, underlying lung disease. Mr. Floyd had had a history of COVID, but there was no evidence in his lungs at the time of his death that he had any lung disease that would impair his ability to breathe. And it ruled out injuries to the neck that suggest that the bones in his neck had been broken, for example. And it ruled out a stroke. He didn't have a stroke, so it wasn't like his blood pressure was so high that, he ruptured a vessel in his brain. He didn't have an aneurysm. He didn't have, which is a ruptured vessel. He didn't have an embolism, which is a blood clot. He didn't rupture his heart. He didn't have an old heart attack or a recent heart attack or what's called myocardial infarct. So the autopsy is really great for ruling things out.
Dr. Thomas, just to focus on one of those, you said the autopsy ruled out a recent myocardial infarction.
Yes.
How does it do that?
Well, when a forensic pathologist examines a heart, one of the things they look at is the coronary arteries, which are the vessels that supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle. And then the pathologist will examine the muscle of the heart. And if someone has had a recent heart attack, there may be evidence in the heart muscle of that damage. Or if they've had a prior and older heart attack, there will be scarring in the heart muscle that shows that area of damage.
Thank you, doctor. Is it normal as a part of your death investigation then to seek out and to look at the video?
Yes. Oh, yes.
In this case, is there any particular video footage that struck you as more significant than others from what you saw?
Oh, gosh, this case, there were so many. The body-worn camera videos were very instructive because they started, and the cup foods video, because they showed how Mr. Floyd was behaving long before law enforcement interaction. Then the body-worn cameras show the early interactions before there was any of this subdural restraint and compression. And then they show the interactions during the subdural restraint. The bystander videos are really instructive, as well as the surveillance videos from the scene at showing kind of during the time of the restraint. So there were lots, I would say.
So in terms of the video footage then either ruling in a cause or ruling out a cause, how did it inform your assessments about the cause of death, having looked at the video?
Well, it helped me rule in a cause and also rule out causes, I would say.
So did it help you determine whether this was what I might refer to as a lights out kind of death, a sudden death?
Right. So what I observed from all of these videos is this was not a sudden death. Mr. Floyd did not, it's not like the snow shoveling where I told you somebody comes in, collapses, and clutches their chest and falls over. There was nothing sudden about his death. So that's what I would have expected if it was a cardiac arrhythmia or abnormal beating of the heart. Typically those are someone really falls over pretty quickly, and this was not that. Likewise, it was not the type of death that has been reported in fentanyl overdose, for example, where someone becomes very sleepy and then just sort of gradually, calmly, peacefully stops breathing. This was not that kind of a death. So I felt comfortable ruling out those as causes of death. And then on the flip side, I could clearly see from watching the video what happens to Mr. Floyd during this subdural restraint and compression, and what happens to his breathing is it gradually becomes more difficult and then stops.
Doctor, tell us, what is the bellows function?
Well, it's what your diaphragm does along with the muscles in between your ribs. So when you take in a deep breath, what's happening is your rib cage is expanding, and that then forces the lungs to open up, and that's what draws air in. So it's when someone is intubated in like surgery or something, it's sort of the opposite of that, because your diaphragm is paralyzed, and so somebody has to force air in. But under normal breathing circumstances, it's the bellows, it's the pulling air in.
So what did the video tell you? What did you see in it that had to do with the bellows function?
Right. Well, Mr. Floyd is in a position, so first of all, he's prone or sort of slightly with his head to the side, and he has his arms handcuffed behind his back. So that's already a bit of a difficult position to be in, the prone and handcuffed. And then with, at times, at least 3 officers on top of him, whether it's his neck or his back or his lower back or legs, it prevents him from moving his body into a position where he can adequately use the bellows function. And his chest is sort of compressed in this position in such a way that he can't adequately expand and get enough oxygen in.
Over what period of time was this?
9 minutes.
So what did you see in those 9 minutes that led you to conclude that the mechanism of death was low oxygen or asphyxia?
Well, initially, Mr. Floyd is able to struggle pretty vigorously when he's in this position that he recognizes as it's going to be hard for him to breathe in this position.
Sustained. That the last part of the answer about Mr. Floyd's state of mind is stricken as speculative.
Sorry. So initially, when he's in the prone position, he's breathing and speaking, and it might look like, oh, he's at that point getting enough air exchange. But over time, you can see that his breathing is getting more and more difficult, and he's saying less and less. And then about halfway through the whole restraint, subdual, compression process, he stops breathing. Well, he first stops speaking entirely. And then again, shortly after that, there's a movement that I believe is what's called an anoxic brain reaction, which is, it looks like kind of a twitch. It's something that the body does when the brain no longer has enough oxygen. So that's the point at which you can tell by looking, oh, that's where he no longer is getting enough oxygen to his brain. And then the restraint and subdual and compression continue for many minutes more. Even after someone checks and says, oh, there's no pulse, they maintain the position. So at that point, his heart has also stopped. So he's stopped breathing and his heart has stopped.
So doctor, you mentioned an anoxic, anoxic.
Yes.
Anoxic brain reaction.
Yes.
Is that also known as an anoxic seizure?
Yes.
Is that something that a person does consciously and voluntarily?
Oh, no. No, it's something that your body just does when your brain doesn't have enough oxygen. It's why in lots of cases, people who are witnessing someone die will say, oh, they had a seizure and died. Well, no, what's actually happened is they've basically died. Their brain doesn't have enough oxygen, and then they had this muscle twitch that may look like a seizure.
So can we go back to Exhibit 193, and I want to ask you about, that's right in front of you, the other contributing conditions, if we could highlight that, Brad. So do you see where I'm referring to the other contributing conditions?
Yes.
And what are those?
In this case, they are arteriosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, fentanyl intoxication, and recent methamphetamine use.
So would you explain for the jury, what does it mean, other contributing conditions?
So the way forensic pathologists and medical examiners usually use this is, people often think of it, the death certificate is for that person, that specific person who died and their family. And that's true. It does serve a very useful purpose for life insurance, whatever. But forensic pathologists are also using death certificates for public health data purposes. And so in any given case, we aren't just thinking about this particular person and their cause and manner of death. We're also thinking the state and the federal government collect data on why do people die? What is cause of death? It's how we know as a country that we have, how many people die of COVID, for example. It's because death certificates list that. So one of the things that we use this other contributing conditions for is to list disease processes or drugs that are present at the time of death, but that we don't believe directly contributed to the cause of death. But it's so that someone looking at data years from now can say, okay, we want to do an evaluation of all deaths during law enforcement subdual. And how many of those deaths involved someone who also had drugs on board? Because that may be something that is relevant then in trying to prevent these sort of deaths in the future, for example. Or the case where I use other contributing conditions probably the most is the hip fracture case that I talked about before, where someone dies of a hip fracture due to a fall, but they're 84 years old and they also have hypertensive heart disease, arteriosclerotic heart disease, asthma, diabetes. And so I will list those as other contributing conditions. Now, in no way did those things cause the fall and the hip fracture and the resulting whatever pneumonia or whatever. But again, someone from a data perspective might want to know, of the 84-year-old women who die of hip fractures, what percentage of them have underlying heart disease? Because again, from a data collection standpoint, does that provide useful public health information that can be used in the future to try and prevent these deaths? So that's how I would view this. It's very long-winded, sorry.
Sure. No, Dr. Thomas. So in understanding this is further, so other contributing conditions are conditions that may have contributed but were not the direct cause of the death.
Exactly.
Did you consider these other contributing conditions in your assessment of the cause and mechanism of death for George Floyd?
Yes.
And how did you consider them, first of all?
Well, I wanted to look at each one and ask the question, is this the cause of his death? Is arteriosclerotic heart disease the cause of his death? He has narrowing of his coronary arteries. In many cases, that is the cause of someone's death. So I looked at that, but again, it comes down to what were the history of the terminal events. Does this look like the type of death we see, or I'm not a clinician, so I don't see it, but as a forensic pathologist, I know from hundreds of families describing what happened at the time of death, that this death does not fit what has been described in someone who dies of a cardiac arrhythmia from arteriosclerotic heart disease. And likewise, hypertensive heart disease. Those tend to be cardiac arrhythmias, sudden cardiac deaths. This is not that kind of death. Likewise, fentanyl intoxication, as I described. And again, I don't treat patients, I don't see living people, but what I know from family members who describe deaths that then later turn out to be due to fentanyl, the death is slow, it's peaceful, they fall asleep, they may hear. Generally is, again, much more of a sudden death. It may cause a cardiac arrhythmia, it may cause a seizure, and by that I don't just mean this sort of terminal anoxia. Again, looking from what I know about Mr. Floyd's death, because it's so well documented, that does not fit.
Psychology.
Yes, oh yes.
How would you characterize the amount of meth in Mr. Floyd's system at the time?
Well, it was there. It's not particularly high. Certainly in deaths that I have attributed to methamphetamine, it's been much higher. But it's not like there's any safe level of methamphetamine, but this was a very low level.
So was the methamphetamine significant in your assessment of the cause of death?
No.
So then, based on your review of the video and application of your work, experience, and knowledge, did you rule out drug overdose as a cause of death?
Yes.
And that's an opinion you hold to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
Now, I wanted to clarify this earlier and just forgot to. Does the medical examiner also complete the death certificate?
Yes, we don't issue it. That comes from the county or state. But as the medical examiner, we fill out all of the cause and manner and how injury occurred and all that kind of stuff.
How many death certificates have you filled out?
Oh, gosh, well, thousands and thousands.
So if we look here again at the exhibit in front of you, 193, in the left margin, we see a reference here to underlying.
Yes.
Would you tell the jurors what that means?
Sure. So let's go back to that hip fracture, because I keep referring to that. But for example, someone who dies of a hip fracture, generally that's not a sudden death. What happens is someone gets a hip fracture, they get it surgically repaired, they may get pneumonia or something like that. So then, in that kind of case, we would list the immediate cause of death as pneumonia. The underlying cause of that is the hip fracture that was operated, but the underlying cause of the hip fracture was the fall. They fell, they got a hip fracture, they got pneumonia. So it's something that is used when you have a death that has maybe multiple sequences of events. But in a case like this, you don't need an underlying because it's all included in the first line. It's all due to the law enforcement subdual restraint and neck compression.
Now, the death certificate does not use the word asphyxia or any reference to low oxygen.
No.
Would you have used the word asphyxia in this case?
Probably not. I tend not to use the word asphyxia much because it requires a lot of explanation. It doesn't really offer much additional information unless you have a chance to have a discussion like we've had about what asphyxia means. So I tend to just list, if someone dies of hanging, well,
Related photographs that are going to be shown to you, or as we call, as you've heard me say, published to you. We're going to go old school this time. We're not going to put everything on the monitors. We're not going to broadcast it out. But everybody in the courtroom will have access to it, including yourselves. Essentially, a packet with these photographs. We'll collect them afterwards because these are for you to use in the courtroom. The actual exhibit will be available in deliberation, however. Mr. Blackwell?
Yeah, would you either like the deputy or someone distribute these, or should I?
You can go ahead, Mr. Blackwell. Before you look through them, you can take them out, but don't start looking through them until Mr. Blackwell resumes his examination. Mr. Blackwell, Mr. Schaefer will take care of the rest. Give the rest of the... Hold on, Mr. Blackwell. Let's make sure everybody who would like a copy gets one. Spectators. Spectators should each get a copy if they want one. You'll have to give up one of your copies. There you go. Mr. Blackwell?
Your Honor, if I may, I think I'll give one to Dr. Thomas just so she has it.
Actually, she can have mine.
Oh.
That way Your Honor won't have to use the camera at all. So, Dr. Thomas, if we start with the exhibit that's marked 185,
Yes.
I take that back. I would like to see it on my screen. Dr. Thomas, looking at exhibit 185, what is significant in this photograph that informs your conclusions pertaining to the restraint and subdual as a cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
This is a photograph of Mr. Floyd's face, and it shows some facial injuries, most notably what are called abrasions, which are scrapes over his left eyebrow and over his left cheek. You can also see there's littler scrapes or small cuts on his nose and lip, upper lip, and then a little on the left side of his lower lip. But the main thing this shows is that the left side of his face was obviously in contact with some rough surface.
Dr. Thomas, if we look at Exhibit 235, it may be a close-up of the same area.
Sorry, here we go. Yes. Yes, that is a close-up of the left cheek and the left forehead. And you can see, for example, above the left eyebrow, there's a dark area, that's a dried scrape, as well as there's a little bit of discoloration of the skin, so that also there was a bruise there. And then on his left cheek, you can see the dark area as well as kind of a lighter orange pink area, and those are, again, scrapes. The dark area is where a scrape has dried.
And what does it tell you about the cause or mechanism of his death?
It's consistent with the impression from watching the video that his face was on the ground and he was moving his face in an effort to get into a position where he could breathe.
Let's look at Exhibit 188.
This is a photograph of Mr. Floyd's left shoulder.
And what did we see here?
This, again, is an area of scrapes and indicates that there was some force between his shoulder and some rough surface, in this case the ground. And again is consistent with what it looks like on the video, that he's struggling to push himself into a position where he can breathe.
Let's look at Exhibit 187.
This is a photograph of his right shoulder, and again, you can see there's a little bit of discoloration, and then the skin is scraped. So there's less injury impact here, and that fits with, again, what you see in the video of which side was down and which side had more contact with the ground.
Let's look at Exhibit 189.
This is a photograph of Mr. Floyd's left hand, and if you look at the base of his hand, sort of right over his wrist, you can see there's some areas of red discoloration with kind of a pale area in between. And that's consistent with handcuff marks. You can also see on the sort of outer edge, there's some white material that's dried skin, and that's an area where his skin has actually been rubbed up from the handcuffs.
And Doctor, Exhibit 190?
Exhibit 190 is a photograph of his right hand and wrist. And again, in this case, you can see more clearly the sort of the double-lined discoloration above his right wrist that's consistent with the handcuff marks and indicates pressure against handcuffs. And again, on the outer edge, you can see there's a little bit where it's darker and then there's some white skin. So that's an area where it's actually been scraped. The skin has actually been scraped by the handcuffs. Also, on this photograph, you can see on the knuckles of his index finger and middle finger, there's some skin that is scraped off. And that's consistent with what you can see on the video where he's pushing against, I think it's the rim of the car tire or something, to try and push his body into a position again where he can breathe.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Your Honor, the jurors may put the photographs away if they'd like.
All right. This is Chief Roll 20. Members of the jury, we're going to collect those photographs.
Not the actual exhibits, they're simply for your use during this time. And we'll ask the spectators also to return the exhibits. You can keep yours. Counsel can keep theirs. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. So Dr. Thomas, having looked at this physical evidence from the autopsy, was that evidence in of and by itself conclusive?
No. There are multiple ways that scrapes and bruises can happen. It's only useful in the context of what is seen in the videos.
Was there any evidence to suggest that Mr. Floyd was suffering from a potentially fatal condition on the evening of May 25th, 2020?
No.
Do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, if Mr. Floyd would have died that night had he not been subject to the subdual and restraint of the police?
There's no evidence to suggest he would have died that night, except for the interactions with law enforcement.
Now, were there other mechanisms that you felt contributed to Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes.
Could you generally characterize what those were?
Sure. So I think a secondary mechanism in this case is what I refer to as physiologic stress. And by that, I don't mean like the stress, oh, somebody's a type A personality and they have a deadline at work and they're just really stressed about it. I'm not talking about that kind of stress. I'm talking about the kind of physical stress you feel when you're driving along and all of a sudden a car swerves right in front of you and you slam on the brakes and you realize, oh my gosh, if I hadn't reacted, if that had happened a second earlier, I would have been in a potentially fatal car crash. And you can feel your heart race and you kind of, and then the car speeds on and you slow down and you realize, I'm okay, everybody in the car is okay, and your heart rate then slows and or I think even worse, you're at the beach and you suddenly realize, my toddler, I haven't seen my toddler in, oh my gosh, where's my toddler? And that rush of adrenaline you get, and you feel flushed and you get goosebumps and your heart races and you feel short of breath, and then there they are, they're getting an ice cream cone and you'd go, oh, okay. But it takes you a minute for your heart to kind of slow down and your blood pressure to slow down and you to be able to take a deep breath and recover yourself. So that's the kind of physiologic stress I'm talking about, only instead of after a second or a minute, this goes on for minute after minute after minute for 9 minutes, where you are terrified and you can't, there's no recovery. So it's that kind of fear of life that I'm talking about for physiologic stress.
Are you able to tell us what is going on in the body during the physiologic stress? So
it's the reactions are, you get chemical release, you get adrenaline, noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine, and those are things that make your heart race, your blood pressure go up, you require more, your muscles get ready to act, to go run, to do whatever you need to do, slam on the brakes. And so you start needing more oxygen in your muscles. You need to take more breaths. You need more oxygen for your heart rate because your heart's beating faster. There may be other chemicals that are released, whether it's stress hormones or cortisol or things like that. There may be lactic acid that's produced as your muscles. When you have a heavy workout, your muscles get tired and kind of sore. It's because there's been an increase in lactic acid, and it's your muscles working. So all of those physical things, those chemical things, can cause reactions in the body that put additional stress primarily on your heart, but also on all of your body systems, because your body requires your chemistry to be in very fine balance. And when there's too much, say, lactic acid, or too much, not enough, not an ability to compensate for that elevated lactic acid, then all of your body organs will get into trouble.
Doctor, do you consider that physiological stress that you're describing a direct cause or mechanism of death, or is it secondary?
Well, I guess I would consider it a contributory cause, or contributory to the cause of death. It's another contributing mechanism.
And so the direct cause is what, and then the secondary cause is what?
So their sort of primary mechanism, I think, is asphyxia, and the secondary, or low oxygen, and the secondary mechanism is this physiologic stress. But ultimately, the cause of death is the subdural restraint and compression.
So this physiologic stress, or physiological stress that we're discussing, is that something that can be observed on autopsy?
No.
And why is that?
Well, it's a chemical reaction. It's increased heart rate, which of course we don't see at autopsy. It's increased chemicals that we can't test for at autopsy. So none of it is anything that can be seen physically.
So it's a functional mechanism.
Yes, that's a good way of describing it.
Is low oxygen then also a functional mechanism?
Yes.
So could you tell us how you felt that the physiological stress was significant to your conclusion on the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
So Mr. Floyd was already in a position where he was experiencing difficulty breathing and getting enough oxygen in his body. And on top of that now, there's this physiologic stress that's putting increased demand on his heart, increased demand on his lungs, increased demand on his muscles. So all of the things that he's using, his muscles, his strength, his body, to try and get himself into a safe position where he can breathe, those are being doubly stressed by the position that he's in, as well as the underlying chemical reactions that are going on in his body. So it's kind of a double whammy to his heart and lungs and muscles and his whole system.
Okay. So Dr. Thomas, I want to show you Exhibit 194. Again, Your Honor, this has been stipulated to, subject to foundation later. First, Dr. Thomas, can you tell us what this is?
This is a press release that was put out by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office at the time they certified the cause and manner of death of Mr. Floyd.
And is it your understanding that the Medical Examiner's Office generates this type of a press release report in certain cases?
Yes.
So there is a section in the press release report that refers to manner of death.
Yes.
Let's see if we can highlight that. And we see the word there, homicide.
Yes.
We see also in here information we saw on the death certificate, where the press release says also how the injury occurred.
Yes.
And would you read that for the record?
How injury occurred: decedent experienced a cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers.
Again, you agree with that?
Yes.
So let me show you what was marked as Exhibit 918. And homicide is a manner of death, isn't it?
Yes.
And would you explain to the jurors a little bit about what it is medical examiners look to when they're trying to determine manner of death?
Sure. So unlike cause of death, which could be anything, we only have 5 options for manner of death. So a death can be natural, meaning that all of the conditions that contribute to the death are due to just innate processes. Could be cancer, could be heart disease, something like that. Second category is an accident, and that would be something like a motor vehicle crash or an unintended drug overdose. Third category is a suicide, which is death at one's own hands, with at least probably some element of intent. The fourth category is homicide, and that means death at the hands of another. And then the fifth category is undetermined, and that means generally we don't have enough information about this type of death to make a determination to fit it into one of the other categories. So for example, we talked a lot about terminal events early on, and in some cases we have no idea what the terminal events were because the person is just found dead in their residence, and we don't know because they've been alienated from family. We don't know, were they saying they were going to take their lives? Did they have a prolonged history of using drugs? Did they just get out of prison? You know, we're unable to get enough information to sort it into, was this an accidental death or was this an intentional suicide death? And so that would be an example where we might use undetermined, where we just don't have enough information.
So Dr. Thomas, if you look then at the screen in front of you, does this depict or show the manners of death?
Exactly.
And homicide is highlighted, reflecting what Dr. Baker found.
Yes.
And do you agree with that finding?
Yes.
In the case of George Floyd? Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 918.
Any objection? And the exhibit itself is without the highlight, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes.
No. 918 is received.
For the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, these are the 5 manners of death that you were describing, Dr. Thomas.
Yes.
And we've highlighted homicide to reflect what Dr. Baker found and that you agree with.
Yes.
Is there any guidance given to medical examiners about how to select homicide as a manner of death?
Yes.
And,
There is a guide that was published by the National Association of Medical Examiners that provides assistance in how to make a determination between these different.
I want to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 952. Do you see that, Dr. Thomas?
Yes. Yes.
And is this the publication that provides the guidance to medical examiners on how to determine manner of death?
Yes.
Would reference to excerpts from this guide be helpful to your testimony?
Yes.
Your Honor, we offer excerpts from Exhibit 952.
Any objection?
Yes, I do object to this, Your Honor.
All right, actually, would this be a good time to break so we can deal with the sidebar issue as well? right, members of the jury, we'll take our 20-minute. We're probably going to have some work here, so let's come back around 5 after. 11:05.
In terms of this particular exhibit, I don't think it's appropriate for this to be admitted as an actual exhibit because it contains a medical definition of what constitutes homicide. The jury, it's within the province of the jury in terms of the jury instructions that are ultimately provided to them to determine the legal definition of what of this case. So in this particular instance, I think it would confuse the jury between the medical definition and the legal definition. I don't think it's appropriate for this to be admitted.
Well, I can't see the whole exhibit in any case. All I see is the title page.
Can you click to the next screen? Can you see that, Your Honor?
All right, hold on. Do you have any objection to this being shown as a demonstrative?
I don't have it as being a demonstrative, but going back to the jury as an actual exhibit.
That's fine. I'll receive 952 as demonstrative so you can show it to the jury and have them follow along and have Dr. Thomas. I figured at some point you're going to do that with her or Dr. Baker.
Yes.
So that's fine. Okay, as a demonstrative, it is received. All right, 5 after, please. Thomas, just a reminder, you're still under oath.
Thank you.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Thomas, I want to briefly go back to Exhibit 918 that we discussed, and then we're going to resume our discussion on homicide after that. Just to clarify for the jurors what these various classifications are. If we talk about natural, you discussed that with us. As
Yes.
an example of a natural manner of death would be, for example, a heart attack.
Yes.
If we talk about an accidental cause of death, where would drug overdose fit in general as a cause of death?
Usually drug overdoses are accidental unless there's evidence of intent, in which case it would be suicidal.
So we know what suicide is,
Yes.
and undetermined. If the medical examiner can't tell which of these it is or what it is, then undetermined is what you would indicate.
Exactly.
So if the manner of death here has been determined to be homicide, does that, in your opinion as a medical examiner, rule out a death by accidental drug overdose?
Yes.
Now, Brett, let's go back to Exhibit 952. That's admitted for demonstrative purposes. So, Doctor, we were talking about the designation of homicide.
Yes.
And tell us what this guide is as relates to how we define homicide as medical examiners.
Homicide is defined in its most broad sense as death at the hands of another. And it goes into more detail if we wanted to look at that.
Yes. So if, but this is guidance given from the National Association of Medical Examiners to medical examiners.
Exactly.
And it provides guidance and guidelines on how to designate a manner of death as homicide.
Yes.
So Brett, if we could go to the next slide. So Doctor, could you read this in for the record?
Homicide occurs when death results from a volitional act committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as homicide more below. It is to be emphasized that the classification of homicide for the purposes of death certification is a neutral term and neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains a determination within the province of legal processes.
And you agree with this?
Absolutely.
It's a guideline you follow?
Yes.
And have you followed this kind of a guideline for the years you've been a medical examiner?
Yes.
Is there more guidance given from the National Association of Medical Examiner guidelines on what constitutes voluntary acts?
Yes.
If you could click one more, Brett. And so, Dr. Thomas, could you read this for us?
In general, if a person's death results at the hands of another who committed a harmful volitional act directed at the victim, the death may be considered a homicide from the death investigation standpoint. And then, although there may not have been intent to kill the victim died because of the harmful intentional volitional act committed by another person. Thus, the manner of death may be classified as homicide because of the intentional or volitional act, not because there was an intent to kill.
And when you agree with the conclusion that Dr. Baker reached of homicide, is this the definition of homicide that you're applying that we saw in these two slides?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Now I want to ask you about a new subject, and this has to do with certain studies that assess whether the prone restraint is dangerous from a breathing point of view. And I'd like to get your perspective as a forensic pathologist and a medical examiner in this respect. Are you aware of any such studies?
Yes.
Do you agree generally with the research that comes to a conclusion that the prone restraint is not dangerous for respiration?
In certain laboratory safe settings, that may be true, but I do not agree with their applicability to real life situations.
If you could generally characterize for the jurors, what's the punchline of these studies? What do they show?
Well, they purport to show that putting someone in a prone position, even with some restraint and with weight on their back, is perfectly safe.
And do you find the studies to be reliable, or do you find them controversial?
Well, I think they are fine for laboratory purposes, but they bear no resemblance to real-world situations. So I would say they're irrelevant for purposes of what we're talking about here.
And so how do they then not relate to the real world? What's artificial about them?
Well, I would say for starters, these are volunteers who have agreed to be put in this dangerous position of a prone restraint. But they know perfectly well at any point, if they feel scared or uncomfortable, all they have to do is say, stop. And that has happened in some of these studies, that a couple of the volunteers have said, wait, no, I can't tolerate being in this position. It's too scary. So that, to me, immediately takes out that whole element that we were talking about the terror, the physiologic stress. So that's number one. Number two is they're healthy volunteers. These are young people who have, mostly young people, mostly healthy, who have agreed to be part of this study. So it doesn't relate to someone who may have other underlying factors that may contribute. Thirdly, they're put on like a gymnastics mat to be face down. So it's completely different when you're squished between a person and a hard ground versus having a evenly distributed weight on your back and you're on a mat. Fourth, I guess, and perhaps most significantly here, none of them went on and on and on beyond the point where the person stopped breathing and where their heart stopped. So they were being monitored the whole time, and if at any point they had significant respiratory or cardiac difficulties, the study would have stopped, and the person volunteering knew that. So to me, it bears no resemblance to what Mr. Floyd experienced.
Did any of the studies involve a knee on the neck of any of the volunteers?
No.
Any of them go on for as long as 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No.
Do you know if any of the studies actually measured the decrease in lung volumes as part of the study, that is, decrease in oxygen reserves?
Not that I know of, no.
So any relevance to George Floyd at all?
Not in my opinion, no.
So, Dr. Thomas, have you done any calculations or kind of work of your own to measure what the subdual and the restraint with the knee on the neck and the back of George Floyd would have done to his oxygen reserves or lung capacities?
No, that would be something I would completely defer to a pulmonary doctor to address.
So then are you able to tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you haven't done that work, whether the forces that Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have even killed a normal, healthy person?
In the way you phrased that, not based on lung volume and that kind of study. I mean, from watching the video, I certainly wouldn't want to be in that position, but that's a different answer.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
Mr. Nelson.
You don't want. morning, Dr. Thomas.
Morning.
How are you today?
Good, thank
Good.
you.
Nice to see you. You described being a forensic pathologist as sort of being the doctor's doctor, right?
General pathologist is considered that, yes.
Right. And the forensic pathologist, in terms of a death investigation, you kind of have to wear many hats, right?
Yes,
You have to have a broad familiarity with multiple medical conditions, right?
yes,
And sometimes medical conditions may appear at autopsy that you've never seen before,
yes,
right? Some strange disease that you've never seen, right?
yes,
And you have to, you will speak to other doctors, right?
yes,
You will gather information and share that, they'll share information with you to help you conclude, make conclusions in an autopsy, right?
yes,
And you also described how being a medical examiner is more than just the autopsy, right?
yes,
The autopsy is one small part of a death investigation, right?
yes,
You described reviewing videotapes in certain circumstances, right?
yes,
Past medical records, right?
yes,
Interviews with friends, family members, people who were who knew the decedent, right?
yes,
And ultimately, the medical examiner's office compiles a massive, amount of information itself about the cause and manner of death, right?
yes,
And you've had an opportunity to review a lot of that information in this case, correct?
yes.
Now, have you reviewed all of the interviews of witnesses?
Probably not all of them, no.
Okay. Have you, after you prepared your report, have you been provided with additional materials that may be relevant to your considerations?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. And we'll come back to that. So I just kind of want to, but you did have an opportunity to review Dr. Baker's entire file, right?
Yes,
And I believe we'll be hearing from Dr. Baker later this morning or this afternoon, but we'll have some questions for him. I would like to follow up on some of your conclusions. There's a term used in Dr. Baker's autopsy, the cause of death, the term complicating.
yes.
Can you define, medically speaking, what the term complicating means?
Oh, I guess it could be used in lots of different ways. The way I would think of it in this setting is both things were present, that there was a cardiopulmonary arrest and that it was due to law enforcement subdual restraint and compression. I guess that's how I would consider it in this setting.
Have you been provided with Dr. Baker's, any information about Dr. Baker's opinions in this case?
Nothing very specific. I mean, just what he put in the autopsy report and all of his conclusions.
So in terms of the word complicating, it's capable of different definitions based upon the forensic pathologist, right?
Yes,
Right. And so you, as a forensic pathologist, may have a different interpretation of what complicating means compared to Dr. Baker, for example.
yes,
And there's a reasonable degree of disagreement amongst, in any case generally, it's reasonable for doctors to disagree with each other, is it not?
that sometimes happens, yes.
All right. You did not perform the actual autopsy of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct,
And that was Dr. Baker who did that, right?
yes,
And you know Dr. Baker well,
yes,
and you know him to be a competent medical examiner?
yes,
He's the chief medical examiner for Hennepin County at this time.
Yes.
Now, you were provided again with all of the information from his report, and I would like to go through a few of the things with you. Let's talk about Mr. Floyd's heart first.
Okay.
What was the size of Mr. Floyd's heart as measured at autopsy?
The weight of Mr. Floyd's heart was 540 grams.
And would you explain, or would you describe that as an enlarged heart?
I would say it's a slightly enlarged heart, yes.
And there are some different measures of how to base an enlarged heart, or how to determine if a heart is enlarged, right?
Right. By some categories, that heart would not be considered enlarged.
So there's two, as I understand it, two different kind of primary measurements, or primary ways of comparing Mr. Floyd's heart to determine if it's enlarged, right? The Molina studies and the Northwestern studies.
Oh, I see. There's probably multiple ways of looking at heart weights. I mean, those are two of them. There's the study from the Mayo Clinic. There's one in Europe. There's lots of ways of analyzing.
But ultimately, based on all of your information, you would agree that Mr. Floyd's heart was slightly enlarged, right?
Yes.
In terms of the DeMaio and Molina standard, what would a normal male heart weigh for a person similar to Mr. Floyd?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Would you disagree if I said it was 383 grams?
That well could be. For the average, I mean.
For the average, right.
Yeah.
So, according to, if that were the average heart rate, or heart size, heart weight, 383 grams, relevant to Mr. Floyd's heart would be considered profoundly enlarged.
Well, the thing about using averages in especially medicine, which is of course what I'm most familiar with, is we don't generally just compare it to an average. We usually compare it to an average plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So that's why the range that I usually use is, from 253 to 510 grams would be the range of normal for someone of Mr. Floyd's height. And so I don't know in the DeMaio Molina study what their 2 standard deviations would be. Okay. But I wouldn't use just the average.
Okay, and so in terms of how you would assess the weight or size of the heart, you would say 510 grams is the high, 510 grams is the high end?
Right.
Of that, and 540 exceeds that, right?
Right.
And so in terms of whether it's a very enlarged heart or even a relatively minimally enlarged heart, a larger heart requires more blood, right?
Yes, it has greater demand, yes.
What are some of the things that cause a person to have an enlarged heart?
Probably the primary cause is high blood pressure.
And you understand, based on Mr. Floyd's medical records, that he did in fact have a history of high blood pressure, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe the blood vessels of the heart?
There are several major coronary arteries that, as I mentioned, supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle. There's the left and right, and then the left branches into the left anterior descending and the left circumflex, and then there's some other branches off that.
And how would you describe narrowing or stenosis of the coronary arteries?
So the way we as forensic pathologists describe it is we look at the opening. So if an opening is fully open, then that would be 0% narrowing. And if it's completely closed, then that would be 100% occluded. And so then we look at anything ranging from 25, 50, 75, 90%. Obviously, it's just an eyeball estimation. We don't actually get out calipers and measure because the actual percentage doesn't really matter. It's more, did they have coronary artery disease? Was it pretty good, pretty bad? That sort of thing.
Can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing?
The way the coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, they come off of the aorta, which is the main vessel that takes blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And so in close to the aorta is called proximal to the aorta, and then the further out it goes, distributing blood along the way to the heart muscle, is called distal.
And when you have proximal narrowing, how does that affect the heart?
It can narrow the blood supply to more of the heart than if you have distal narrowing.
Another way of saying that would be it decreases the amount of blood the heart is getting, right?
Yes.
And it also affects how things are removed from the heart, right? Like CO2, carbon dioxide.
Well, that's different. That wouldn't happen from the blood vessels coming in, I don't think. So I wouldn't include carbon dioxide in that.
Is there a standard within forensic pathology where pathologists would consider to be that there's enough of a narrowing to cause sudden death?
So the way I would describe that is anything over more than 70 to 75% is, in the view of a forensic pathologist, something that, in the absence of another cause of death, could be used to explain death. Now, it's also true that people live with 100% occlusion and go on and do fine. So you have to understand this is strictly my perspective as a forensic pathologist, and everyone I see is dead. So that's kind of a different perspective.
Can you explain what myocyte necrosis is?
The myocyte is the name of the heart muscle cell. So cyte means cell, it's C-Y-T-E, and myo means muscle. So when you have a heart myocyte, it's the heart muscle cell, and necrosis means death. So if you see myocyte necrosis, that means there are dead heart muscle cells.
And do you have to have myocyte necrosis to cause sudden death?
No, you don't have to have myocyte necrosis.
And would you say that hypoxia is the absence of oxygen? Agreed?
Yes.
And can hypoxia of the heart cause sudden death by other means?
Hypoxia means low oxygen, sorry. And your question is, can low oxygen to the heart cause sudden death through an arrhythmia, I presume? Yes.
Okay. What would you, how would you describe the conduction system of the heart?
The way the heart beats, the lub-dub, is that there are electrical currents that go through the heart muscle. And normally there's a certain sequence in which the heart muscles will fire. And that's called the conduction system, through which the electrical impulses flow. And that's what keeps the heart beating in a regular rhythm, that beat, beat, beat. And yeah, that's the conduction system.
So what happens if the conduction system is impaired?
Then you can get what's called an arrhythmia, or abnormal beating of the heart.
And that can result in sudden death?
It can, yes.
Which artery supplies that kind of like that pacemaker of the heart?
Oh, it probably is variable from person to person. I mean, I think the coronary artery that we consider the most important usually is the left anterior descending coronary artery, but there's a lot of individual variability.
Can you, what about the right coronary artery?
It really depends on any given person. which part of the heart is supplied by their particular distribution.
Okay. And in Mr. Floyd's autopsy, the right coronary artery, Dr. Baker determined had a 90% occlusion, correct?
90% narrowing, yes.
When someone is exerting themselves, does that make the heart work harder?
Yes.
Does that mean that more blood, oxygen, it needs more blood to function? The heart needs more blood to function at that time?
Yes.
It's kind of like when we think about exerting anything like jogging, running, the heart needs more blood and hence more oxygen in order to function properly, right?
Yes.
You also described the fight or flight kind of the physiology of that in your consideration, right?
Yes, the physiological stress. Mhm.
And the physiological stress produces adrenaline, right?
Yes.
And that also causes the heart to work harder
Yes.
and therefore need more blood
Yes.
and more oxygen.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. In this particular case, right, we have a heart that is at least above average, right, needing more blood. We have a heart with a occluded right coronary artery, right, narrowed.
Mm-hmm.
We have a heart that the left anterior descending artery also had a 75% narrowing, right?
Yes.
And so you have, and then you have an exertion of stress producing adrenaline, right?
Yes.
So the heart has to work very, very hard in this case. Fair to
Yes.
say? Let's take the police out of this, and I'm going to ask you a hypothetical. Let's assume you found Mr. Floyd dead in his residence, no police involvement, no drugs, right? The only thing you found would be these facts about his heart. What would you conclude to be the cause of death?
In that very narrow set of circumstances, I would probably conclude that the cause of death was his heart disease.
So have you, as a forensic pathologist, ever certified a death due to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
Probably thousands of times, yes.
With similar degrees of narrowing of the arteries?
Yes.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiomegaly? I'm trying to...
Yes, hypertensive cardiovascular disease, yes, absolutely.
With a heart at this weight or even smaller?
Well, if it was, again, in this setting where that was the only abnormal finding, then I would probably go with that, yes.
So one of the things that has to be considered in this particular case is Mr. Floyd's heart, right?
Yes.
And even without any sort of an exertion, again, take the exertion out of it, take the police out of it, take the drugs out of it, that's a potential cause of death that needs to be considered.
Yes.
You discussed the abrasions that you saw and the jury saw pictures of. You would agree that the abrasions are in a left to right pattern?
Meaning there are more on the left than on the right?
Right.
On his face, yes. On his shoulder, yes. And then he had the abrasions on his right hand.
And even in terms of the pattern of the abrasion, there's up and down an abrasion could go from the bottom of my body up, or it could go from left to right, right?
Yes. I guess I didn't really focus on what direction the abrasions were going in that sense.
Okay, and that's fine. But you would agree that one possible way that at least some of these abrasions occurred would be when Mr. Floyd was initially put down on the ground.
I guess they could, yes.
Right. And not all of those abrasions necessarily occurred while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, right?
That's hard to answer,
Right.
I would say.
It's hard to answer when the abrasions were there and
Right.
what caused the abrasions, right?
Right.
And if someone was being held down with the weight of 3 people, would you expect those to be more punctile in their nature, or abrade, like with the lines and movements?
Oh, gosh, there are too many variables there, I would say.
Okay. Now, you ultimately determined that this case was an asphyxiation, essentially, right?
Yes, that was the primary mechanism.
Right. And asphyxiation is simply the lack of oxygen to the brain,
Yeah, low oxygen, inadequate oxygen.
inadequate oxygen to the brain specifically.
Yes.
And in terms of asphyxiation, you would agree that there are multiple things that can cause asphyxiation.
Yes.
So you use the reference to someone being strangled, right?
Yes.
So if I came up to you and I strangled, or I strangled a person, put my hands around their neck, there are certain things that you would expect to see, right?
Sometimes you do, yes. And that's great when you do. You don't always, but
And those would be things like a broken hyoid bone,
yeah,
right? The petechial hemorrhaging that you discussed.
yes.
And in an asphyxia death, there are frequently, those types of signs available, right?
Well, it really depends on the mechanism of asphyxia.
Okay, so let's go back to the mechanisms of asphyxia. You described strangling would be one,
Yeah,
hanging could be one,
yes.
right? You've described positional or mechanical asphyxia.
Those are types, yes.
Yep. Positional being, based on the position of the body. Mechanical being something, using some sort of a device to asphyxiate someone.
Oh, well, we haven't really talked a lot about positional and mechanical. I mean, there's all kinds of things under both of those that can cause low oxygen.
And one of the things that can cause a low oxygen to the brain is the use of controlled substances, correct?
Well, eventually, yes. Yes.
So someone can ingest a particular type of a controlled substance. That particular substance could affect the diaphragm, right?
It affects some controlled substances affect the ability to breathe, which then decreases the oxygen, which then leads to low oxygen, yes.
Right. And that's essentially what you're saying is that there, in this particular case, as I understand it with my notes, is that essentially what happens is there was some event that happened that resulted in a decrease of oxygen to the brain, and that resulted in death.
Yes.
And that's essentially what asphyxia is generally.
Inadequate oxygen, yes.
Right. Okay. And you were asked a series of questions about some studies in terms of, I think they're called they're out of San Diego or
Yes, Dr. Chan. And
Dr.
his group.
Chan's,
Mhm.
right? Yep. Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine?
Yes.
Now, you testified that some of the problems with the Chan studies were that they were in laboratory settings. Sorry, laboratory settings. That they were controlled environments, healthy individuals, etc. Right?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Christine Hall and her paper, Incidence and Outcome of Prone Positioning Following Police Use of Force in a Prospective Consecutive Cohort of Subjects?
Is that the one from Canada?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was essentially an analysis of actual police encounters, correct?
Yes. In
And-
Canada.
In Canada, understood. But they actually, that study, they go through and they look at the number of police-citizen interactions, correct?
Yes.
And then from those police-citizen interactions, they further go in to look at how many involved being placed in the prone position or a non-prone position, correct?
Yes.
They consider various actual real-life variables, agreed?
Yeah.
And including drugs, whether drugs were on board, whether the length of time to a certain extent that someone was in the prone position, agreed?
Yes.
And ultimately, they analyzed about 3,000 prone positional placements
Yes.
out of a total of like 1.1 million police interactions.
Yes.
So 1.1 million police interactions resulting in about 3,000 prone position arrests. That those these are real people, real incidents, right?
Yeah.
And in those 3,000 or so interactions, there were no deaths that occurred.
Isn't that amazing? When you consider that virtually every forensic pathologist in the United States has probably had an officer-involved death like this. How did they, it utterly baffles me, which is why I kept saying Canada, because I think, I don't know what's different, but
I'm going to object at this time as
sorry.
non-responsive.
Yeah, the answer was for you, not response.
So let me ask you, in terms of hypoxia, can you again define hypoxia?
Low oxygen.
Right. And which organ is more sensitive to the lack of oxygen? The brain? The brain.
Absolutely.
The brain's the most, it needs the most oxygen, right?
Yes.
And that's because it's doing millions of things simultaneously, right? Agreed?
Yes. I'm sure there's lots of reasons metabolically why it needs oxygen.
Right. I think a previous witness testified that it takes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply to function, right?
That sounds about right, yes.
But the heart also needs oxygen, right?
Yes.
So in terms of the professional standards for determining an asphyxia death, is it true that you have to first exclude all natural and non-natural cases or causes of death?
Well, you can have natural and non-natural causes of low oxygen. So I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand.
Sure. There's a criteria that's established for making a determination of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, right?
Well, I'm not really sure what, I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Fair enough. Is the prone position in and of itself inherently dangerous?
Not if there are no other factors.
Okay. So the prone position is examined and used in a lot of different settings, right?
Correct.
I mean, even in hospitals, in the treatment of, say, COVID, the prone position is used.
Correct.
And in those circumstances, being in a prone position is not inherently dangerous, right?
Yes.
I mean, chiropractors put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
Massage therapists put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
So the prone position, I'm just talking generally
Right,
speaking, no
right.
other factors. The prone position in and of itself is not inherently dangerous, right?
Right.
Is the prone position on concrete inherently dangerous?
Again, with no other factors, as long as someone can breathe, no.
Right. I could be laying by the pool in Florida, right?
Right.
On my stomach in the prone position, not inherently dangerous.
Right.
Do you know, or did you take into consideration Mr. Chauvin's weight in your analysis?
Oh, I'm aware of his weight. I would say I took it into some consideration, but it wasn't a major factor one way or the other.
Okay. You reviewed all of the videos, right?
Yes.
And it's fair to say that portions of his weight were placed on Mr. Floyd's body at a different distribution.
Yes.
And ultimately, in terms of the autopsy that Dr. Baker conducted, in terms of the area in the shoulders, the back, and the neck, no bruising was found, right?
Right.
In your experience as a forensic pathologist, if someone is placing a significant amount of weight on a person's area for a prolonged period of time, would you expect to see bruising?
You might or might not. It's so variable.
And you would agree that there are no abrasions or bruising described in the autopsy in the neck area of Mr. Floyd?
Correct.
There's no bleeding into the muscles in his back, right?
Correct.
You would agree that the knee is sort of a pointy or a more protuberant part of the body?
I guess so. Kind of flat on top because of the patella, but
Right. And when we talk about the shin bone itself, there's not a lot in between the skin and the shin bone, right?
that is true. Yes.
And it's sort of a triangular shape, right?
Yes.
And again, along Mr. Floyd's back, there's no long bruise consistent with a shin bone, right?
Right.
And there's no more circular bruise consistent with a kneecap.
Right.
You've reviewed, obviously, a lot of strangulation type cases in those, in your career.
Yes.
Strangulation with the hands, right?
Primarily manual, but also ligature.
Ligature being like a rope or a phone cord or something.
Exactly.
And in those manual strangulation cases, the pressure that's exerted in that will frequently leave bruises, fingerprint-sized bruises, right?
Frequently, but not always.
And ultimately, what increases the likelihood of seeing a bruise is the amount of force that's applied, right?
You know, I don't know what all the factors are, whether it's fragility of the vessels, whether it's the length of time, whether it's the force, whether it's the location. I think there are lots of variables.
So, yes.
And everyone bruises differently.
So yesterday depends on what medications they may take, right? So yesterday there was an analysis or an analogy to sitting on a church bench and you don't bruise your behind.
And that can feel long.
Would it be different if you're sitting on a church bench with a baseball, for example, underneath your butt?
I really couldn't say.
All right. So in terms of Dr. Baker's autopsy, you would agree that there's really no objective evidence showing any pressure to the back of Mr. Floyd.
There is nothing at the autopsy. That's correct.
Did you find, or did Dr. Baker find hypoxic changes in his brain?
He died too quickly for that to show up.
And that's when we talk about the lack of ischemic hypoxia, correct? Dr. Baker noted a lack of ischemic hypoxia.
I don't remember his exact words. You're describing lack of ischemic changes in the neurons?
Correct.
Yes.
In the brain.
Yes, because that has to happen over a period of time.
Okay. And when someone is experiencing that shortness of oxygen or that lack of oxygen to the brain, that will frequently lead to certain symptoms, right?
Yes.
Confusion is one.
That could be, yes.
Restlessness,
Could be, yes.
shortness of breath,
Could be.
visual changes,
Could be.
incoherent speaking.
Could be.
So, to your knowledge, did Mr. Floyd, in the videos that you observed, ever complain of these any visual changes?
No.
Did he appear to be confused to you?
So what time period are we talking about? Sorry.
Sure, that helps, maybe if we narrow down that time. The 9 minutes, during the 9 minutes that Mr. Floyd was restrained, did he appear confused to you?
Oh, gosh. How do you describe his behavior?
Well, I mean, did he was articulating that he was in pain, right?
Yes, and then he couldn't breathe and he calls for his mother and he says he loves people. I mean, you might interpret that as confusion or you might interpret it a different way.
Did he appear to be breathing during this time frame?
Not effectively.
Do you know how many breaths per minute?
No.
If one expert indicated it was at a rate of 22 breaths per minute, would you disagree?
I would have no way of assessing that.
When someone is hypoxic, they start breathing faster, right?
That can be a mechanism of trying to balance.
At least for the first 5 minutes or so, Mr. Floyd was talking, right?
Well, again,
In talking, yes or no? He was talking.
he was, yes, there were words, yes.
So he had an open airway.
Yes.
And you would agree that, or would you agree that at some point he went limp,
Yes.
right? And would you describe what you saw as the progression of hypoxia in that instance at the point he goes limp?
That is certainly a good explanation for it, yes.
Was not a sudden hypoxic event, right?
That is my interpretation, yes.
You would agree that if he was progressively growing hypoxic, you would expect whole body hypoxia? I'll rephrase my question.
Yeah,
'cause
sorry.
I'm not a doctor, so I have to rely on my notes quite a bit. So if he was progressively suffering from whole body hypoxia, the brain would be the first thing that would show signs of hypoxia.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes, the brain is the most sensitive.
And you would agree that that would not occur in a matter of seconds, but it would take a matter of minutes, right?
Correct.
And asphyxia due to position or compression, that prevents air from getting into the lungs, right?
Yes.
And that leads to what we would call a global hypoxia.
We haven't really used that word global.
Whole body.
I mean, if there's inadequate oxygen, the blood flows everywhere. So I guess that's what you're talking about.
But the brain is the first thing to show symptoms of hypoxia.
Right, that's the most sensitive organ.
And in this particular case, where you have a 90% stenosis of the right coronary artery, that's going to be limiting oxygen to the heart, right?
Yes,
And he has a big heart, right?
yes,
Needs more blood.
yes,
And adrenaline speeds up the heart.
yes.
Methamphetamine speeds up the heart.
It can, yes.
So methamphetamine and adrenaline cause the heart to work harder
Yes.
And
that can
inc-
happen.
and increases the heart's oxygen needs.
Yes.
And at what point does the stenosis in the left and right coronary arteries become critical and cause the heart to stop? Generally.
Oh. Are you asking that same question about, as a forensic pathologist, what degree of narrowing do we consider potentially fatal?
Right.
70, 75% and above.
Now, in terms of drug use, right, you obviously were aware, based on the toxicology, that Mr. Floyd had certain drugs in his system, right?
Yes,
And so when we say on board, that means in the system.
yes.
Would you describe the use as you know, based on the information that you have, as sort of a binge use of drugs?
Oh, I guess I couldn't answer that.
Are you familiar with drug use taken or used rectally?
I've heard of that, yes.
And that increases or speeds up the distribution of controlled substances in a person?
It speeds up absorption, yes.
So the effects would be felt much faster.
Yes, they could. Mhm.
In a case where you have a person who is experiencing cardiac arrest, right? And they're put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital for resuscitation. There often there's IVs that are placed in a person, right?
Yes,
And those IVs contain saline,
yes,
and saline can ultimately dilute or decrease to some degree the amount of controlled substances that would be as they would be measured.
that's a theoretical possibility.
You'd agree that fentanyl is a respiratory depressant, right?
Yes,
It slows breathing and lowers oxygen in the blood.
yes.
Does the fact that there's norfentanyl in his blood mean that he took it some time ago?
Yes, but by some time, that's a very vague, yeah.
So long enough in the past to start metabolizing.
Exactly, exactly.
But does it exclude him taking fentanyl more acutely or more recently in time?
No, there's no way really of knowing the timing.
Fentanyl depressing the respiratory system can also act with the coronary artery or can interact with coronary vessel disease, correct?
Can you clarify that? I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Does fentanyl's depression of the respiratory system also act with coronary artery vessel disease and oxygen and carbon dioxide to reduce the supply of its supply to the heart?
Oh, so as fentanyl may lead to a gradual progression of slowing breathing and ultimately decrease the oxygen, that would apply to oxygen to the brain as well as to the heart. Is that what you're, yeah.
And it would likewise increase the carbon dioxide in the blood.
Yeah, I mean, anything that decreases respiration decreases that exchange.
So as that exchange process is happening, right, you're not taking in the oxygen, you're likewise not expelling the carbon dioxide, right?
Right.
And thus the carbon dioxide will increase because you're not expelling it, right?
Correct.
You would agree that methamphetamine is a stimulant, right?
Correct.
And that can cause a cardiac arrhythmia,
It can.
and it can increase a person's heart rate, right?
It can or cannot.
And you testified before that methamphetamine, there's no safe level of methamphetamine, right?
Correct.
So the fact that methamphetamine is at a lower toxicological standard doesn't somehow make it safe.
Right.
It doesn't exclude the possibility that it could increase the heart rate.
It could or not.
In terms of the evidence in this case, were you made aware that drugs were found in the backseat of the squad car,
Yes.
and that those drugs contained the DNA of Mr. Floyd,
Yes.
and that those drugs were at least to some degree partially dissolved,
Yes.
and that those drugs were fentanyl, a mixture of fentanyl and methamphetamine?
Yes.
Based on the toxicology in this case, did you see any metabolic byproduct of methamphetamine?
No.
And so that means that the methamphetamine was taken more acutely or recently in time.
Probably. I mean, there's lots of variables.
So again, just kind of taking into consideration removing certain variables, right? You find a person at home, no struggle with the police, right? And the person doesn't have a heart problem, but you find fentanyl and methamphetamine in this person's system at the levels that they are at. Would you certify this as an overdose?
Again, in the absence of any of these other realities, yes, I could consider that to be an overdose.
And the level of fentanyl in a person, again, in this hypothetical scenario, there are deaths certified as drug overdoses significantly lower than 11 nanograms per milliliter.
Lower, higher, it's got a huge range, yes.
As low, I believe, as 3% or 3 nanograms per milliliter.
Yes.
Right. So the ingestion of drugs is unique to that individual's body, right?
Right.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Ms. Blackwell.
Dr. Thomas, a few things I'd like to try to clarify with you.
Thank you.
You were asked a number of questions that were to the effect that if we take the police subdual, restraint, and neck compression out of this, what would you conclude Mr. Floyd's cause of death to be? Remember those questions?
Oh, yes.
Aren't those questions a lot like asking Mrs. Lincoln,
Yeah.
if we take John Wilkes Booth out of this,
Objection, argument.
may I finish? It's my analogy.
That's
Your Honor.
argumentative.
Dr. Thomas, if we put the police subdual, compression, and neck compression into this, restraint and neck compression into this, what was the cause, the manner of death for Mr. George Floyd?
The cause of death was the law enforcement subdual, restraint, and compression, and the manner of death is homicide.
Does it make any sense to you whatsoever from the standpoint of trying to assess cause and manner of death for Mr. Floyd to be answering questions having to do with hypothetically taking the facts of this case out relating to his subdual, restraint, and neck compression?
You can finish the question.
Dr. Thomas, from your standpoint as a forensic pathologist and your analysis of manner and cause of death, would you ever approach an assessment of manner and cause of death by taking out of it the facts that you found relevant and highly pertinent to assessing and determining the manner and cause of death?
No.
And in this case, those factors are what?
The law enforcement subdual, restraint, and compression.
And you were asked questions again about fentanyl and meth. Remember those questions?
Yes.
Do you know what quantity of meth was even involved or found in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream?
I have the number,
Well, let me ask you a
but
question.
it was very small. I mean, I do know that.
And so this was the point. You found that it was a very small amount.
Correct.
Were you able to assess, based on the amount, what kind of effect, if at all, it would have on the stress or strain on his heart?
No. There's too much individual variability to correlate one number with one person's reaction.
Well, let's see with respect to fentanyl, if there's a punchline we can get to with respect to fentanyl. Fentanyl has been discussed with you, Dr. Thomas, as a respiratory either depressant or suppressant.
Yes.
In order for us to go from fentanyl to death, in the middle, there are certain symptoms and responses and reactions a person would have who's suffering from fentanyl overdose or intoxication.
Yes.
If the person doesn't have those symptoms, those indicators, then would you feel that it's possible even to conclude that they are suffering from fentanyl intoxication or overdose?
No. If there's no signs of fentanyl overdose, then it makes no sense to conclude that there was an overdose from fentanyl.
And to be clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what are those symptoms of fentanyl overdose or intoxication?
So fentanyl is an opioid. It's like morphine or heroin, and it causes slowing. Well, first of all, it's a potent pain medication and given mostly for that, but it also can cause slowing of the respiratory rate in a very gradual, peaceful, non-struggle kind of way. What is described as people just fall asleep and may just kind of slump gradually over because they very peacefully stop breathing, or it slows and then eventually stops.
And they fall into a sleep out of which they can't even be aroused.
Correct.
Would that be also known as a coma?
Yes, ultimately it's a coma.
When George Floyd was on the ground for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, was he asleep to the point of not being able to be aroused?
Not for the first half of it, no. And then afterwards, he was completely unresponsive, but that's a different.
For the second half, he was unresponsive with no pulse.
Exactly.
Was George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, ever in a coma that you saw?
No.
So when we talk about fentanyl overdose, did you ever see, as applied to George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds,
Okay.
did you ever see, as relates to fentanyl overdose, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that he was on the ground and during the subdual and restraint by Mr. Chauvin, that he ever exhibited any of the symptoms of fentanyl intoxication?
No.
You asked, again, quite a few questions about the heart. And remember that discussion.
Yes.
I think it was to the effect the heart was slightly enlarged, high blood pressure, narrowing of the coronary arteries, dead heart muscle cells. Do you recall all of that being discussed?
Yes.
In order for us to go from there being issues with damage to the heart to a death from damage to the heart, in the middle, do we have to have certain cardiac events that then lead to death?
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if we're going to talk about heart conditions, what are those conditions in the middle that actually lead to death?
Well, what ultimately leads to death is an arrhythmia, an abnormal beating of the heart. And as I described, it's generally it's often called a sudden cardiac arrest because it's sudden and someone just drops over.
Now, to be clear, when we're talking about these various heart conditions and a sudden cardiac arrest, fatal arrhythmia, did you see any indication with all this discussion about heart conditions that Mr. Floyd ever suffered from a sudden fatal cardiac arrhythmia as the primary cause of death?
No.
Was there any evidence that Mr. Floyd suffered from a heart attack?
No.
If you bring to mind what was found during the autopsy, was there any injury found to Mr. Floyd's heart whatsoever?
No.
So if we talk about, for example, dead heart muscle cells, any dead heart muscle cells seen on autopsy?
Not that Dr. Baker described and not that I saw, no.
In fact, his heart was so ordinary in terms of non-injury that it wasn't even photographed intact, was it?
Not intact, no. Dr. Baker took one photo that showed no scars and no acute injury.
Now, you were asked about certain studies out of Canada
Yes.
on the prone position.
Yes.
And now, and the findings out of Canada, supposedly with real police and real police settings, was no fatalities.
Yes.
Are you familiar with any such studies reaching that conclusion in the United States of America?
No.
What is so peculiar then about Canada that we're talking about Canadian studies here?
That's what I don't understand. I don't. I mean, yeah, I found that study and I just thought, I don't know how to interpret this because it's so contrary to the actual experience of forensic pathologists in the United States.
Now, you asked questions about whether the prone position is safe to lay on your stomach.
Yes.
Are you familiar with whether or not laying in the prone position automatically brings about a reduction in the oxygen reserves somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 24%?
I am not aware of that, but I would defer to a clinician.
Perhaps a pulmonologist?
That would be the best, yes.
I think you were, in fact, asked a question about laying by the pool on my stomach in Florida.
Yes.
George Floyd was not laying by the pool on his stomach in Florida, was he?
No.
I know the answer to this, but I'll ask you. You asked a question about sitting on a church bench with a baseball under your butt. You've never done that.
No.
Now, you were asked questions about symptoms of damage to the brain
Yes.
and whether there was any evidence of damage to Mr. Floyd's brain.
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury whether the fact that you observed an anoxic seizure in Mr. Floyd, was that evidence of damage to the brain?
So yes, what happens in the brain is when there's inadequate oxygen, it reacts by causing this anoxic reaction or seizure that we've described. If someone then goes on and essentially is brain dead, but their heart can be restarted and they're kept alive for, say, a day, and then they die, then you will see changes in the brain. But in a case like Mr. Floyd, where he died during this period of time and his heart was never able to be restarted, that is not enough time for the brain cells to show any kind of reaction that you could see at autopsy.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
Any further?
Yes, very good.
Dr. Thomas, after the heart stops, if a heart stops, is it possible that the body will continue to breathe or respire?
Yes, I suppose it could in some circumstances.
And that continued respiration after the heart stops could be a matter of a minute or two, correct?
I suppose that could happen.
And you would agree that methamphetamine also further constricts the arteries, right?
It can do that.
And so that constriction, there's been a lot of discussion about the level of methamphetamine in the system, this low level as it's been described, right? You said there's no safe level, agreed?
Yes.
Would you, as a physician, prescribe methamphetamine to a person who has a 90% or a 75% occlusion to his or her heart?
Objection, Your Honor, is beyond the scope and relevance.
You may answer if you have an opinion in that regard.
Yeah, I don't have an opinion. I'm sorry.
Okay, no further questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. You're excused. Members of the jury will take our lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 1:30.